Sometimes the things everyone else throws away hold the greatest treasures. We've all felt overlooked at one time or another, dismissed as not worth the trouble. At Copper Lake, an old steamboat sat abandoned for 20 years. The town offered it free to anyone who'd take it away. Every contractor looked at the rusted hull and walked off. Too damaged. Not worth fixing. Then Calla Bryer showed up with nothing but a canvas bag and nowhere else to go. She didn't see a worthless wreck. She saw a home. So she claimed the boat and started cleaning it out. That's when she found the hidden compartments. Secret casks filled with bonds and silver bars worth $5 million. Treasure from old-time smugglers that nobody knew was there. The quiet woman everyone ignored was now sitting on a fortune. But what happens when a whole town suddenly wants what you found? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you, Calla. Bryer had been walking mountain trails for 3 days when she first saw Copper Lake spread out below, her like a mirror catching the afternoon sun. Her canvas bag, worn smooth at the corners from years of carrying everything she owned, pulled heavy on her shoulder as she made her way down the switchback path toward the water's edge. She wasn't running from anything exactly, more like walking toward something she hadn't found yet. The old cabin she'd been renting up on Granite Ridge had finally given up, the roof caving in during the last heavy snow. The landlord had shrugged and told her she was welcome to camp there if she wanted, but he wasn't putting any more money into repairs. At 62, Calla had learned not to take such things personally. Sometimes structures just reach their limit, same as people. The town of Copper Lake nestled against the shoreline like it had grown there naturally, which in a way it had. What started as a supply stop for miners heading up into the high country had gradually settled into the kind of place where 3 generations might live within walking distance of each other. And everyone knew whose porch light meant you were welcome to stop by after dark. Mayor Tom Henderson ran the hardware store that had been in his family since 1923, and he had the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a man who still knew how to fix what he sold. His wife Martha kept the town's only restaurant, a place called simply Martha's, where the coffee was always hot and the pie was whatever she'd felt like making that morning. Pete Kowalski owned the marina, if you could call 3 weathered docks, and a bait shop, a marina, and he'd been watching boats come and go on Copper Lake for 47 years. He had opinions about everything that floated and most things that didn't, and he wasn't shy about sharing them with anyone who'd listen. But it was the boat that caught Calla's attention as she walked along the shoreline that first evening, her boots crunching on the rocky beach. The steamboat sat tilted against the far dock like an old dog that had lain down and couldn't quite remember how to get back up. Even in the fading light, she could see the rust streaks running down its white hull like tears, and the way the upper deck sagged where the supports had given way. "That old thing?" Pete had said when she'd asked about it the next morning, nodding toward the boat while he sorted through a tackle box. "Been sitting there near 20 years now. Town's been trying to give it away for free, but every contractor who looks at it just shakes his head and walks off. Hull's probably rotted clean through." Calla sipped her coffee and watched the morning light play across the water. "Who owns it now?" "Technically, the town council. Previous owner died without family. Boat was part of his estate. We've been looking for someone to haul it away, but the cost of disposal," Pete shrugged. "Might as well try to move a mountain." She'd walked out to look at it that afternoon, her practiced eye taking in the damage with the same methodical assessment she'd use on any structure. The hull showed rust stains, but rust didn't always mean rot. The deck had soft spots, but deck planking could be replaced. The wheelhouse windows were cracked, but glass could be fixed. What others saw as a derelict, Calla saw as possibility. "You thinking about that boat?" Martha had asked when Calla stopped in for dinner, the kind of gentle probing that small towns specialized in. "Might be," Calla had replied, cutting into her meatloaf. "Depends on what it would take to make it livable." "Livable?" Martha's eyebrows went up. "Honey, that thing's been taking on water for years. Pete has to pump it out every few months just to keep it from sinking at the dock. But Calla had spent 30 years making impossible places into homes. The cabin on Granite Ridge had been a trapper's shack when she'd first rented it. Nothing but 4 walls and a leaking roof. She'd patched and weatherproofed and coaxed it into comfort, one small improvement at a time. A boat wasn't so different from a cabin, really. Just a house that happened to float. The town council meeting that Thursday had been brief. Mayor Henderson had looked surprised when she'd made her offer to take the boat off their hands, but not displeased. "You understand there's no warranty," he'd said, his tone careful. "What you see is what you get, and what you see is, well, it's seen better days." "I'm not looking for luxury," Calla had replied. "Just something that'll keep the rain off." The paperwork had taken longer than the discussion. Transfer of ownership, liability waivers, dock rental agreements. By the time she'd signed the last form, half the town seemed to know about the crazy woman who'd claimed the old steamboat. "She's got grit. I'll give her that," she'd overheard one of the council members say. But grit doesn't fix a rotted hull. Calla had moved her few belongings aboard that same afternoon. The canvas bag held her clothes, a few tools, some books she'd read so many times, the pages fell open to her favorite passages without being asked. She'd learned long ago that mobility meant choosing what mattered most, and what mattered most could usually fit in one bag. The boat's interior was darker than she'd expected, thick shadows falling across the main cabin despite the afternoon sun outside. Decades of neglect had left their mark, warped floorboards, water stains on the walls, the musty smell of dampness that had settled too deep to be easily scrubbed away. But beneath the neglect, she could see the bones of something well built. The main cabin was spacious, with built-in seating that curved along the windows. The galley was compact but complete, with a small stove and icebox that might still work with some attention. There were 2 small sleeping cabins toward the stern, and what looked like storage areas she hadn't fully explored yet. Pete had been right about the water. She could hear it lapping somewhere below, a soft rhythm that spoke of slow leaks rather than catastrophic damage. Tomorrow she'd need to trace those leaks, see what could be patched and what needed replacing entirely. Tonight, though, she spread her sleeping bag on the driest section of the main cabin floor and listened to the gentle motion of the boat responding to the lake's evening breeze. Through the cracked windows, she could see lights beginning to appear in the town's windows, families settling in for another night in homes that had sheltered them for years. She'd been sleeping under other people's roofs for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to rest in a place that was truly hers, however damaged it might be. The boat creaked gently as the water moved beneath it, a sound that spoke not of weakness but of flexibility, of a structure built to bend with forces rather than break against them. In the morning, she'd start the real work of making this place home. She'd patch the leaks, replace the rotted boards, coax the old systems back to life. She'd done it before with less promising materials, but tonight, surrounded by the soft sounds of water and wind, Calla Bryer allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years, the quiet satisfaction of a person who'd found exactly where she belonged. The leak announced itself at 4 in the morning with a steady drip that found its way through 2 deck levels to land precisely on Calla's forehead. She lay still for a moment, listening to the rhythm. Drip, pause, drip, trying to trace the sound's path through the boat's structure. She'd been living aboard for 5 days now, long enough to learn the boat's normal sounds. This was new. By dawn, she had her tools spread across the main cabin floor, a flashlight, pry bar, hammer, and the small collection of screws and patches she'd brought with her. The drip seemed to originate somewhere near the portside galley, but water had a way of traveling through spaces you couldn't see, following the path of least resistance until it found somewhere to fall. She started by pulling up the loose floorboards near the galley, boards that flexed more than they should when she walked across them. Beneath, the boat's frame showed the expected wear, some surface rust, wood that had seen moisture, but nothing catastrophic. She'd seen worse in buildings that had weathered decades of mountain storms. The third board she lifted revealed something unexpected. The space beneath wasn't just structural framework. Someone had fitted a panel there, a piece of wood that matched the surrounding planking but sat just slightly higher than it should. When she pressed on it, it gave way with the soft resistance of wood that wasn't nailed down but merely fitted into place. Calla sat back on her heels, studying the panel in her flashlight beam. In 30 years of renovation work, she developed a sense for when something was intentional versus accidental. This panel had been designed to be removable, which meant someone had wanted access to the space beneath. She worked the panel free carefully, mindful that forcing it might damage whatever lay underneath. It lifted out cleanly, revealing a cavity that had been carved from the boat's original structure. The space was lined with what looked like tarred canvas, and it held a single wooden cask about the size of a milk pail. The cask showed none of the water damage she'd expected. Its wood was dark with age, but solid, and the metal bands that held it together showed only surface tarnish. Someone had taken considerable care to protect whatever was inside. Calla lifted the cask from its cavity, surprised by its weight. Not heavy enough to be full of coins, but substantial enough to suggest contents more significant than papers or cloth. The lid was fitted tightly, but not sealed permanently, another sign that someone had intended this to be opened again. She carried the cask to her sleeping area, where the morning light fell most directly through the cabin windows. The lid lifted with some effort, revealing contents wrapped in what appeared to be oiled leather. Layers of protection that spoke of items meant to survive years of storage. The first bundle contained maps, hand-drawn charts on heavy paper that showed the lake and surrounding mountains in careful detail. The cartography was professional quality, marking not just the obvious landmarks, but small trails, creek beds, and geographic features that wouldn't appear on any standard map. Someone had taken considerable time to document every possible route through the high country. Beneath the maps lay more bundles, each wrapped with the same care. One contained documents, papers covered in careful handwriting that she couldn't immediately read in the dim cabin light. Another held what appeared to be small metal objects, tarnished but carefully preserved. But it was the final bundle that made her hands pause in their unwrapping. The leather fell away to reveal bars of metal that caught the morning light with a dull gleam. Not gold, but silver. 3 bars about the size of her hand, each stamped with markings she didn't recognize. Even tarnished, their weight and feel spoke of genuine precious metal. Calla sat motionless for several minutes, the silver bars resting in her lap while she tried to process what she'd found. This wasn't a homeowner's small cache of valuables. This was evidence of something organized, something that had required planning and resources. She rewrapped the silver carefully and turned her attention to the documents, spreading them on the cabin's small table where the light was better. The handwriting was clear enough to read, though the language was formal in the way that suggested an earlier era. The papers appeared to be records, dates, locations, quantities of goods moved along the mountain routes marked on the maps, references to cargo and deliveries and secure storage. What emerged was a picture of systematic transportation of valuable goods through the mountains, using routes that avoided the main roads and settlements. Smuggling, she realized. Someone had used this boat as part of a smuggling operation, moving goods through the mountains, using the lake as a way station. The hidden compartment, the careful preservation of documents and silver, the detailed maps, all of it pointed to an enterprise that had operated over time with considerable success. But when? The papers bore dates, but the ink had faded to the point where she could make out only partial numbers. Sometime in the late 1800s, she guessed, based on the formal language and the paper quality. She spent the rest of the morning examining her discovery, handling each item with the care it had been shown by whoever hid it. The maps revealed routes she recognized from her years of mountain walking, trails that still existed but were now used mainly by hunters and hikers. In the late 1800s, Those routes would have offered perfect alternatives to the main roads where territorial authorities might be watching for contraband. By afternoon, she'd carefully returned everything to the cask and restored the hidden compartment to its original appearance. But her mind kept returning to what she'd found, and more importantly, what it might mean. If there was one hidden compartment, there might be others. If this cache represented part of a larger operation, there could be more items stored elsewhere on the boat. And if the operation had been successful enough to justify this level of careful organization, the total value of what remained hidden might be considerably more than 3 silver bars and a collection of documents. That evening, as she made a simple dinner on the galley stove, Calla found herself looking at the boat differently, not just as a floating home that needed repair, but as a vessel that had played a role in history, that had carried secrets through waters that now seemed peaceful and unremarkable. She also found herself wondering who else might know about the boat's hidden past. The previous owner had died without family, according to Pete, but that didn't mean he'd died without sharing knowledge. The careful preservation of the cache suggested someone who'd expected to return for it eventually. The thought brought a chill that had nothing to do with the lake's evening breeze. If someone else knew about the boat's secrets, her claiming it might have attracted attention she hadn't anticipated. And if the hidden cargo was as valuable as it appeared to be, that attention might not be friendly. But for now, she was the only one who knew what lay hidden beneath the boat's floorboards. And she intended to be very careful about who else she might tell. Calla spread the hand-drawn maps across the galley table by lamplight, her dinner forgotten as she traced the careful ink lines that marked pathways through terrain she knew by heart. The cartographer had possessed an intimate knowledge of the high country, every creek crossing, every ridge that offered shelter from weather, every hidden valley where travelers might rest unseen. She recognized Copper Lake at the center of the map, but drawn with details no modern chart would include. The depth markings showed not just where boats could navigate safely, but where the bottom dropped away into channels deep enough to hide things that weren't meant to be found. Small symbols marked points along the shoreline, some she could identify as existing features, others that might have changed or disappeared in the decades since the map was made. But it was the mountain routes that captured her attention. Red ink traced pathways that connected the lake to a network of trails extending deep into the wilderness. Some followed ridgelines she'd walked herself, but others showed routes through country she'd thought impassable. The mapmaker had found ways through landscape that appeared solid from a distance, marking passages that required local knowledge to navigate safely. Each route was annotated with notes in the same careful handwriting she'd seen on the documents. 2 days hard travel. Water scarce, carry extra. Shelter cave at mile marker 7. These weren't casual hiking trails, but transportation corridors planned for moving valuable cargo through hostile territory without detection. She spent hours that evening studying the maps, comparing them with her own knowledge of the region. The routes made sense from a tactical perspective. They avoided the main settlements where territorial authorities would maintain a presence, while connecting resources in the high country with markets in the valleys below. Someone had invested considerable time in surveying and documenting a complete smuggling network. The next morning brought the discovery of the second compartment. She'd been working systematically through the boat's structure, looking for other spaces that might conceal hidden storage. The main cabin had yielded one cache, but the stern sleeping compartments offered additional possibilities. The port cabin showed signs of modification, wall panels that didn't quite align with the boat's original construction. The hidden space behind the cabin's built-in storage bench was larger than the first compartment. Lined with the same tarred canvas protection, this cache contained more casks, 3 of them arranged in a row like soldiers waiting for inspection. Their contents proved the scope of what she'd stumbled into. The first cask held more silver bars, 6 this time, wrapped in oiled leather with the same careful attention she'd seen before. But the second cask contained something that made her hands shake as she unwrapped it. Bonds. official certificates bearing the seal of territorial banks, each one representing significant value even by modern standards. The third cask contained gold coins, perhaps 24 of them, their surfaces untarnished despite the decades of storage. Not just American currency, but coins she didn't immediately recognize, suggesting the smuggling operation had involved international trade. But it was the small leather journal tucked beneath the coins that provided the context. She needed to understand what she'd found. The journal's entries began in 1897, written in the same careful hand that had created the maps. The author identified himself only as J.M., and his occupation as freight coordination, a euphemism that became clearer as she read his methodical records of cargo movements, route conditions, and customer transactions. J.M. had been running a sophisticated operation, coordinating the movement of valuable goods through the mountain territory using the lake as a central depot. The boat had served as both warehouse and transportation hub, with cargo arriving from various sources and being redistributed along the mountain routes according to customer requirements. But the later entries revealed complications. References to territorial patrols and increased scrutiny suggested that authorities were becoming aware of the smuggling network. JM had begun consolidating operations, reducing the number of active routes and increasing security measures. The final entries, dated in late 1898, spoke of a major shipment, a collection of gold and silver from mining claims that couldn't be processed through official channels. The language was cautious, but the implication was clear. JM had been hired to transport the proceeds of mining operations that were either illegal or being conducted outside territorial oversight. Calla closed the journal and sat back, trying to process the implications of what she'd discovered. This wasn't just a historical curiosity. The gold, silver, and bonds in the hidden compartments represented genuine wealth, carefully preserved and waiting for someone who knew where to look. But why hadn't J.M. returned for his cash? The journal's final entry suggested he'd expected to be away from the lake for several weeks while completing the major shipment. Something had prevented his return. Death, imprisonment, or circumstances that made returning too dangerous. She spent the afternoon inventorying what she'd found, handling each item with increasing awareness of its significance. By her rough calculation, the silver and gold alone would be worth tens of thousands in today's market. The bonds, if still valid, might be worth considerably more, but with the growing realization of the cash's value came an equally growing awareness of the danger it might represent. If JM's operation had attracted territorial attention in 1898, it was possible that knowledge of the hidden wealth had survived in some form. Local families might possess stories passed down through generations, tales of treasure hidden somewhere around Copper Lake. That evening, as she prepared another simple meal, Calla found herself listening more carefully to the sounds outside the boat. Footsteps on the dock, voices carrying across the water, the creak of other boats responding to the lake's gentle motion, sounds she was learning to recognize as normal, but which now seemed to carry new possibilities for threat. She was no longer just a woman who'd claimed an abandoned boat for shelter. She was the guardian of wealth that others might kill for, sitting alone on a floating target in the middle of a lake surrounded by people who'd spent their entire lives hearing stories about treasures that might be hidden in the local landscape. The smart thing would be to turn everything over to authorities. Let proper channels determine ownership and distribution. But something in JM's careful documentation, his methodical approach to preserving wealth that had been earned through considerable risk, made her reluctant to simply hand over his life's work to bureaucrats who'd never understand what it had cost to accumulate. Besides, she'd claimed the boat legally. Whatever it contained was legally hers now, wasn't it? The town had wanted the boat gone, had been happy to sign it over to anyone willing to take responsibility for it. But as she settled into her sleeping bag that night, Calla couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer alone on the lake. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her windows, she sensed attention focused on the old steamboat and its new, resident, a tension that might prove far more dangerous than leaking roofs or rotted floorboards. The morning sun turned the lake surface into hammered silver as Calla secured the last of the hidden compartments and prepared for her trip into town. She'd spent most of the night reading JM's journal by lamplight, and the story that emerged had changed her understanding of what she'd discovered entirely. The silver bars weren't just precious metal, they were payment for legitimate mining claims that had been worked outside the territorial tax system. The bonds weren't stolen goods but investments, purchased with money that miners couldn't deposit in banks without drawing unwanted attention from territorial authorities. JM hadn't been running a criminal enterprise so much as providing financial services to people who were earning honest money through methods the government preferred not to acknowledge. But it was the references to the disappeared caravan that had made her hands tremble as she read. In September of 1898, JM had contracted to transport the accumulated wealth of a dozen mining operations from the high country to markets in Denver. The caravan had never arrived at its destination, and territorial authorities had assumed it had been attacked by bandits somewhere in the mountain passes. According to JM's final entries, the assumption had been wrong. The caravan had made it safely to Copper Lake, where the wealth was transferred to the boat for what should have been the final leg of the journey. But JM had received word that territorial marshals were waiting along the planned route. Tipped off by someone who knew too much about the operation's schedule and methods, rather than risk capture, JM had hidden the wealth aboard the boat and disappeared into the mountains, intending to return when the official attention had moved elsewhere. He'd never come back. The trip to the town library took longer than Calla had expected, partly because she found herself checking over her shoulder more often than usual. The feeling of being watched had persisted through the morning, though she couldn't identify anything specific that justified her unease. The library occupied the ground floor of a building that had served various civic functions since the 1920s, and the local history section consisted of 3 shelves tucked into a corner near the back. But what she found there confirmed JM's story in ways that made her mouth go dry. The Copper Lake Gazette had covered the disappearance of the mining caravan in considerable detail during the fall of 1898. Headlines spoke of 12 men and fortune vanish in high country and territorial marshal expands. Search for missing miners. The CT estimated value of the disappeared wealth had been 200,000, a sum that would translate to millions in modern currency. But the most significant detail appeared in a follow-up article dated 3 weeks after the initial disappearance. Territorial authorities had found the caravan's wagons abandoned in a high mountain valley with no trace of the men who'd been driving them or the wealth they'd been transporting. The official conclusion was that the caravan had been attacked by a well-organized band of outlaws who'd left no survivors. Calla sat back in the hard library chair, staring at the yellowed newspaper page. The official story was wrong. The caravan hadn't been attacked. It had successfully completed its journey to Copper Lake. The men who'd driven the wagons had simply melted back into the mountains after transferring their cargo, probably returning to their mining claims to continue working until they could accumulate another shipment worth the risk of transportation. But JM, the wealth had never made it past Copper Lake. Instead of continuing to Denver, everything had been hidden aboard the boat, where it had waited for more than a century for someone to discover it. She was sitting on a fortune that had been legally earned, carefully transported, and properly hidden by someone who'd intended to return for it. The territorial authorities, who'd been waiting to intercept the shipment, had been foiled by JM's caution, but they'd also prevented him from completing his mission. The wealth was orphaned, neither stolen nor abandoned, but simply lost to circumstances that no longer applied. Doing some genealogy research, the voice belonged to Mrs. Patterson, the librarian, a woman in her 70s whose family had lived around Copper Lake since before the town was incorporated. Local history, Calla replied, closing the newspaper volume carefully. I'm curious about the old mining operations in the high country. Oh, there were dozens of them back in the day, Mrs. Patterson said, settling into the chair across from Calla with the manner of someone who enjoyed sharing local knowledge, most played out by 1900. But there are still old claim markers scattered all through the mountains. My grandfather used to tell stories about miners who'd work a claim for months, then disappear with their gold rather than pay territorial taxes on it. What happened to all that wealth? Mrs. Patterson shrugged. Probably spent in Denver or San Francisco, wherever the miners went when they left the territory. Though there were always rumors about treasure hidden somewhere around the lake. Old-timers used to say that not all the gold made it out of the mountains. Calla kept her expression neutral, but her pulse quickened. Rumors? The kind of stories that get passed down in families, you know. Tales about mysterious lights on the lake at night, about boats that would arrive and leave without stopping in town. My grandmother claimed she used to see signals from the old steamboat, lantern flashes at specific times of night. The old steamboat. Calla's steamboat she never investigated? Heavens, no. This was still rough country then. People minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions about their neighbors' affairs. But the stories persisted for decades. Every few years, someone would claim to have found evidence of hidden treasure, though nothing ever came of it. Calla thanked Mrs. Patterson and left the library with considerably more knowledge than she'd arrived with, but also with the unsettling realization that she wasn't the first person to wonder about treasure hidden around Copper Lake. The difference was that she'd actually found it. The walk back to the marina took her past Martha's restaurant, where several local men were gathered around the counter for their afternoon coffee. Their conversation stopped when she passed the window, and she felt their eyes tracking her progress toward the dock. "That's the woman who took the old steamboat," she heard one of them say as she moved beyond earshot. Pete was working on an outboard motor when she reached the marina, but he looked up as she approached the boat. "How's the restoration coming along?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes alert. "Slowly," she replied. "Lots of water damage to work through. Find anything interesting in all that old junk?" The question was phrased casually, but something in Pete's manner suggested more than idle curiosity. "Just the usual accumulation of years," she said. "Previous owner seems to have been a pack rat." Pete nodded, but his attention lingered on her longer than felt comfortable. "Well, you let me know if you need any help with disposal. Some of that old stuff might be worth something to collectors." As she climbed aboard the boat, Calla found herself wondering exactly how many people in Copper Lake had heard the old stories about treasure and mysterious boats, and whether any of them were paying closer attention to her salvage work than she'd realized. The leather-bound journal had been tucked into the deepest corner of the third hidden compartment, wrapped in oiled canvas and sealed with wax that had kept moisture away for more than a century. Calla found it while systematically searching the boat's starboard side, where the structure offered additional spaces that might conceal storage. This compartment was the largest yet, extending beneath the main cabin's seating area in a space that would have been invisible to casual inspection. The journal lay beneath two more casks of silver and a collection of carefully wrapped items that she hadn't yet fully examined. But it was the written record that commanded her immediate attention. J.M.'s full name had been Jonas Mitchell, and his journal revealed a man of considerable education, operating in a world that demanded both cunning and courage. The entries began in 1895, when he'd first established his freight coordination business, and they documented 3 years of successful operations before the final disaster that had stranded his wealth aboard the boat. But it was the financial records that made Calla's hands shake as she read by lamplight. Jonas Mitchell hadn't been exaggerating when he'd described the disappeared caravan as his largest shipment. The accumulated wealth from 12 mining operations, combined with his own profits from years of successful transportation services, had totaled more than $300,000. In 1898 currency, she'd found a $5 million treasure. The journal's later entries revealed the scope of Mitchell's operation and the careful planning that had gone into protecting his client's wealth. He'd maintained detailed records of every transaction, every route used, every contact in the network of miners, merchants, and transporters who'd made the system work. The boat had been equipped with multiple hidden compartments, specifically to distribute risk. If one cache was discovered, the others might remain safe. But the final entries, dated in October of 1898, told a story of increasing danger and ultimate betrayal. Mitchell had learned that someone within his network had been providing information to territorial authorities, feeding them details about shipment schedules and routes. The missing caravan hadn't been a random target. It had been deliberately intercepted by marshals who'd known exactly when and where to wait. Mitchell's response had been to go completely underground. He'd moved all accumulated wealth to the boat, dismissed his network of contacts, and prepared to disappear until the official attention moved elsewhere. But he'd never gotten the chance to execute his exit strategy. The journal's final entry was dated October 23rd, 1898. Territorial Marshal arrived at Lake this morning. Someone has provided him with detailed information about boat modifications and storage methods. Cannot safely remain or return. Cache will remain sealed until circumstances allow recovery. God willing, this record will provide necessary information for eventual retrieval. Calla closed the journal and sat back, trying to process what she'd learned. Jonas Mitchell had been betrayed by someone he'd trusted, someone with intimate knowledge of his operations. He'd been forced to abandon everything he'd worked for, leaving behind wealth that represented not just his own success, but the accumulated earnings of dozens of honest miners who trusted him to transport their gold and silver safely to market. The moral implications were staggering. This wasn't stolen money or ill-gotten gains. It was the legitimate earnings of working men who'd been denied access to proper banking services by an arbitrary and often corrupt territorial government. Mitchell had been providing a necessary service, helping honest people protect the fruits of their labor from officials who viewed every successful independent operation as a threat to their authority. But with the realization of the treasure's true scope came an equally powerful awareness of the danger her discovery represented. If the cache was worth $5 million, there would be people willing to kill for it. And if local families had been passing down stories about treasure hidden around Copper Lake for more than a century, her claiming of the boat might have attracted more attention than she'd realized. The next morning brought the first direct evidence that her situation had become complicated. Mayor Henderson arrived at the marina while she was having coffee on the boat's small deck, and his manner was considerably more formal than it had been during their previous interactions. "Morning, Calla," he said, standing on the dock with his hands clasped behind his back in a way that suggested official business. "Mind if I come aboard? There are some things we need to discuss about your restoration project." She invited him onto the boat, but kept the conversation on the deck rather than allowing him into the cabin where he might notice details about her work on the boat's interior. "Structure. I've been hearing concerns from some of the town council members," Henderson said, accepting her offer of coffee but not sitting down. "There are questions about the historical significance of what you might be doing here." "Historical significance?" "This boat has been part of Copper Lake's landscape for decades. There are people who feel that any major modifications should be reviewed by appropriate authorities before proceeding." Calla kept her expression neutral, but her mind was racing. What kind of authorities? State Historical Preservation Office, for one. There might also be federal considerations if the boat was involved in territorial-era transportation activities. The phrase was too specific to be coincidental. Someone had been doing research, possibly prompted by questions about what she might find during her restoration work. "I'm just making it livable," she replied. "Patching leaks, replacing rotted boards, basic maintenance." Henderson nodded, but his eyes were scanning the boat's structure with the attention of someone looking for specific details. Of course, but if you discover anything of historical interest during your work, documents, artifacts, items that might have significance beyond their immediate utility, the town would appreciate being notified." The request was phrased politely, but the underlying message was clear. Someone suspected she might find valuable items aboard the boat, and they wanted to ensure that any discoveries would be shared with the community rather than kept private. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. After Henderson left, Calla spent the afternoon considering her options. The mayor's visit had made it clear that her activities were being monitored and that there were people in town who expected the boat to yield treasures worth claiming. The question was whether they were operating on general suspicion or specific knowledge. The answer came that evening when Pete Kowalski knocked on her cabin door. "Hope I'm not interrupting your dinner," he said, but he stepped aboard without waiting for an invitation. "I wanted to talk to you about dock fees." They'd already discussed dock rental during her first week, and the arrangements had been clear and reasonable. This was about something else. "The thing is," Pete continued, settling into the galley seating as if he belonged there, "I've been thinking about the liability issues involved in having someone living aboard a boat that might not be structurally sound. Insurance considerations, you know. The boat is sound enough for my needs." "That's what you think now," Pete said, his tone becoming more serious. "But what happens if you find structural damage that makes the whole thing unsafe? What if you discover problems that require professional assessment?" He was fishing, trying to establish grounds for forcing her to allow outside inspection of the boat. The conversation felt rehearsed, as if he'd been coached on what questions to ask. "I'm experienced with structural assessment," she replied. "If I find problems beyond my ability to handle, I'll seek appropriate help." Pete leaned forward, lowering his voice to a confidential tone. "Look, Calla, I like you. You're working hard, minding your own business, trying to make something of that old wreck. But there are people in this town who have long memories about that boat and what it might contain." "What do you mean?" "Stories get passed down in families," Pete said. "Stories about boats that used to move things through these mountains that weren't supposed to be moved. About wealth that disappeared and might still be hidden somewhere around the lake." He was being direct now, abandoning the pretense of casual conversation. This was a warning or possibly a threat. "I don't know anything about old stories," Calla said. "Maybe not yet," Pete replied. "But if you should happen to find anything unusual during your restoration work, anything that might relate to those old stories, you'd be wise to remember that this is a small town where people look out for each other. Wealth that belongs to the community shouldn't be hidden away by outsiders." The message was unmistakable. If she'd found treasure, the town expected to share in it. And if she chose not to share, there might be consequences. After Pete left, Calla sat in the gathering darkness of her cabin, listening to the lake's evening sounds and trying to decide what to do next. The smart choice would be to pack her few belongings and leave Copper Lake before the situation became more dangerous. She could disappear back into the mountains, find another place to live, and leave Jonas Mitchell's treasure for someone else to discover and claim. But something in Mitchell's journal, his careful documentation of honest people being cheated by corrupt officials, made her reluctant to simply abandon what he'd worked so hard to preserve. The miners who'd trusted him with their gold and silver had never received the benefit of their labor. Their wealth had been hidden for more than a century, waiting for someone with the courage to ensure it served its intended purpose. She was that someone now, whether she'd wanted the responsibility or not. And tomorrow she would need to decide whether she was strong enough to keep it. The emergency town council meeting had been called for Thursday evening, but Calla learned about it Wednesday morning when Martha mentioned it during her breakfast stop at the restaurant. "Seems there's some concern about historical preservation requirements," Martha said, refilling Calla's coffee cup with studied casualness. "Questions about whether modifications to significant structures need proper oversight." Calla kept her expression neutral, but the timing wasn't coincidental. 3 days after Pete's warning about community wealth, the town was mobilizing official channels to assert control over her boat and whatever it might contain. "I wasn't aware the boat had historical significance." "Oh, everything around here has historical significance if you dig deep enough," Martha replied. The question is usually whether it's significant enough to matter to people with authority. The meeting was held in the basement of the town hall, a space that normally hosted bingo games and potluck dinners. But the atmosphere that evening was considerably more serious as Calla took a seat in the back row and listened to Mayor Henderson call the session to order. "We're here to discuss the restoration project currently underway on the steamboat docked at Kowalski Marina," Henderson announced. "Recent research has raised questions about the historical importance of this vessel and the proper procedures for any modifications to its structure." Calla felt her stomach tighten as she realized how much preparation had gone into this meeting. Someone had been busy gathering information and building a case for town intervention in her project. Council member Dorothy Walsh was the first to speak. "I've been in contact with the State Historical Preservation Office," she announced, consulting a folder of papers. "They've expressed considerable interest in the boat, particularly given its connection to territorial-era transportation activities." The phrase was becoming a familiar refrain, always delivered with the implication that speaker possessed specific knowledge about those activities. "What kind of connection?" asked Council Member Robert Hayes. "Documentary evidence suggests the boat may have been involved in the movement of goods and materials during the mining boom of the 1890s, Walsh replied. "There are references in historical records to vessels that operated on Copper Lake during that period, facilitating commerce between the high country mining operations and markets in the valleys below." Calla recognized the careful language of someone who knew more than they were saying directly. Walsh had been doing research, but she was presenting her findings in terms that didn't reveal the full scope of what she'd learned. "The Preservation Office has recommended that any restoration work be suspended until proper archaeological assessment can be conducted," Walsh continued. "They're particularly concerned about potential discoveries that might be damaged or lost if work proceeds without professional oversight." Henderson nodded gravely. "The town has a responsibility to protect historical resources, even when they're technically owned by private individuals." The discussion that followed made it clear that this wasn't a debate, but a presentation of decisions that had already been made. The town council had decided to assert control over Calla's boat, using historical preservation as the legal mechanism to force access to whatever she might have found. "What about the rights of the property owner?" Calla finally asked from the back of the room. The conversation stopped, and every head turned toward her with expressions ranging from surprised to hostile. "Property rights are always balanced against community interests," Henderson replied. "When private property has historical significance that extends beyond individual ownership, there are established procedures for ensuring appropriate protection, and if the property owner disagrees with the assessment, then the matter can be resolved through proper legal channels," Walsh interjected. "But in the meantime, work should cease until professional evaluation can be completed." The meeting ended with the council voting unanimously to request a formal historical assessment of the boat and to ask Calla to suspend her restoration work until the evaluation was complete. The vote was presented as a recommendation, but the underlying threat was clear: comply voluntarily or face legal action to enforce compliance. As the meeting broke up, Calla found herself surrounded by townspeople who'd attended but hadn't spoken during the official discussion. Their comments were friendlier than the council's formal pronouncements, but no less concerning. "I hope you understand. This isn't personal," said elderly Frank Morrison, whose family had lived around the lake since the 1920s. "It's just that there have been stories for so long about what might be hidden in that old boat." "Stories?" "My grandfather used to tell us about lights he'd see at night, boats that would come and go without stopping in town. He always said there was more to that old steamboat than people realized." Similar comments came from other long-time residents, each sharing fragments of family lore that painted a picture of community knowledge about the boat's mysterious past. The stories varied in details, but they shared common elements: nighttime activities, valuable cargo, and the persistent belief that something significant remained hidden aboard the vessel. Walking back to the marina after the meeting, Calla realized that her situation had become untenable. The town wasn't just suspicious about what she might find. They had specific expectations based on stories that had been passed down through multiple generations. Someone among the early settlers had known enough about Jonas Mitchell's operations to create lasting legends about treasure hidden on Copper Lake, but the most disturbing revelation came when she reached the boat and found evidence that someone had been aboard during her absence. The modifications were subtle. Items moved slightly from their usual positions. Cabinet doors that she'd left closed, now standing partially open, the faint residue of muddy footprints on floors she'd cleaned that morning. Someone with considerable skill had searched her living space, looking for evidence of what she'd discovered. They'd been careful not to damage anything or leave obvious signs of intrusion. But Calla's years of mountain living had taught her to notice when spaces had been disturbed. Someone had been through her belongings with the thoroughness of a person who knew exactly what they were looking for. The search had been professional, suggesting either law enforcement involvement or someone with similar training. The town council's meeting had been a public distraction while the real investigation took place privately. That night, Calla lay awake, listening to every sound that carried across the water, aware that she was no longer dealing with casual curiosity or community gossip. Someone with authority and resources had decided that the boat contained items of significant value, and they were prepared to use both legal and extra-legal methods to claim those items. The fake deed arrived the next morning. Pete delivered it personally, presenting the document with the apologetic manner of someone carrying out unpleasant but necessary business. "I'm sorry about this," he said, handing her an official-looking paper. "But it turns out there are some questions about the ownership transfer you completed with the town council. The document was professionally prepared, complete with official seals and legal language, but its content was clearly fabricated. It claimed that the boat's previous owner had maintained family connections that hadn't been properly investigated before the town had transferred ownership to Calla. A descendant has come forward with documentation proving family claim to the vessel," Pete explained, "until the matter can be resolved in court. You'll need to suspend any modification work and allow access for proper inventory of the boat's contents." Calla examined the fake deed carefully, noting details that revealed its fraudulent nature. But the document's legal appearance would be sufficient to create bureaucratic complications that could tie up her ownership rights for months while giving the town access to search the boat thoroughly. "Who is this supposed deant?" she asked. "Legal counsel will be in touch with all relevant details," Pete replied, but his reluctance to meet her eyes confirmed that he knew the document was false. The message was clear: cooperate with the town's demands for access to the boat's contents, or face legal challenges that would strip away her rights while the real search proceeded under official cover. The blood-stained letter had been sealed inside the journal's back cover, glued to the leather binding with such care that Calla almost missed it entirely. She discovered it only while examining the journal for hidden compartments, running her fingers along the edges where different materials met. The paper crackled as she worked it free, brittle with age, but still legible in the morning light. The handwriting was Jonas Mitchell's, but shakier than his earlier entries, as if written under stress or injury. The date was November 15, 1898, 3 weeks after his final journal entry about the territorial marshal's arrival at the lake. "If this letter is found, it means I did not survive to tell the truth about what happened at Copper Lake and in the mountains beyond," the letter began. "The wealth hidden aboard this boat is not stolen goods, as territorial authorities claim, but payment for legitimate mining operations that were being systematically robbed by corrupt officials." Calla's hands trembled as she read the careful explanation that followed. Jonas Mitchell hadn't been a smuggler in the criminal sense. He'd been operating an unofficial banking system for miners who couldn't trust territorial banks with their gold and silver. The smuggling had been an attempt to transport legitimately earned wealth past officials who were demanding bribes and illegal taxes from anyone who'd found success in the mining claims. The caravan that disappeared in September was transporting gold and silver that belonged to 12 different mining operations. Mitchell's letter continued. Every ounce was earned through honest work, properly documented, and rightfully owned by the men who extracted it from claims they'd filed and worked according to territorial law. But the most shocking revelation came in the letter's middle section, where Mitchell described the events that had led to his death. Territorial Marshal William Bradford arrived at the lake with information that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of our operations. But Bradford was not interested in confiscating contraband or enforcing territorial law. He demanded the location of all hidden wealth in exchange for allowing me to leave the territory alive. Mitchell had refused to cooperate, leading to a confrontation that had ended with the marshal shooting him and leaving him to die aboard the boat. But Mitchell had survived long enough to hide the confession letter and document the truth about Bradford's corruption. Marshal Bradford murdered me for refusing to reveal the location of wealth that belonged to honest miners, the letter concluded. The gold and silver hidden aboard this boat represents the life savings of working men who trusted me to protect their earnings from corrupt officials. It is not stolen treasure, but stolen justice, taken by men who used their authority to rob rather than protect the people they were supposed to serve. The letter was signed with Mitchell's name, but beneath the signature was a smear of dark brown that Calla realized was dried blood, Mitchell's final testimony, sealed with his life. But the letter contained one more piece of information that changed everything Calla thought she knew about her situation. Marshal Bradford's real name was William Henderson. Mitchell had written in a postscript. He assumed the Bradford identity to hide his criminal activities from territorial authorities who might have recognized his real name. His family has lived around Copper Lake for generations, and they know the truth about what happened here. Henderson, the same name as the current mayor. Calla sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the blood-stained confession while her mind processed its implications. The territorial marshal who'd murdered Jonas Mitchell had been an ancestor of the current mayor, possibly his great-grandfather, given the timing. And if the Henderson family had known the truth about what happened in 1898, they'd also known about the wealth hidden aboard the boat. The recent pressure from the town council, the fabricated historical preservation concerns, the fake deed challenging her ownership, all of it made sense now. The Henderson family had been waiting more than a century for someone to claim the boat and discover its secrets. When Calla had taken ownership and begun restoration work, they'd mobilized immediately to ensure that Mitchell's treasure would end up in their hands rather than hers. But Mitchell's confession letter changed the legal and moral landscape entirely. The wealth wasn't treasure that belonged to whoever found it. It was stolen property that belonged to the descendants of the miners who'd earned it. Mitchell had been murdered for refusing to reveal its location, making his death a homicide rather than a disappearance. More importantly, the letter provided evidence that Marshal Bradford, William Henderson, had been a corrupt official who'd used his authority to rob and murder innocent people. If the current Henderson family had known this truth and had been actively working to claim Mitchell's treasure, they were accessories to crimes that had no statute of limitations. Calla spent the rest of the morning rereading Mitchell's confession and studying the other documents she'd found, looking for additional evidence that might support his claims. What she discovered was a pattern of careful documentation that painted a picture of systematic corruption among territorial officials. Mitchell had maintained records of bribes demanded by various marshals and tax collectors, documentation of mining, claims that had been illegally seized by officials who'd claimed the operators were in violation of territorial law, and correspondence with other transporters who'd faced similar pressures from corrupt authorities. The territorial government hadn't been protecting settlers from criminal activity. It had been the source of much of that criminal activity. using official authority to rob successful miners and settlers of their accumulated wealth. Mitchell's network hadn't been smuggling stolen goods. They'd been protecting honest people's earnings from theft by corrupt officials. The implications were staggering. If Mitchell's records were accurate, dozens of families around Copper Lake had been robbed by territorial marshals over a period of several years. The wealth hidden aboard the boat represented not just Mitchell's own earnings, but the accumulated life savings of honest working people who'd been systematically cheated by their own government. That afternoon, Calla made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Instead of continuing to hide her discoveries or negotiating with the Henderson family for a share of the treasure, she would expose the truth about what had happened in 1898 and ensure that Mitchell's wealth was distributed to its rightful owners. But first, she needed to document everything carefully and secure the evidence where it couldn't be destroyed or suppressed by people who had both authority and strong motivation to keep the truth. Buried, the boat's final hidden compartment yielded the evidence she needed to support Mitchell's claims. Tucked beneath the silver bars and gold coins was a collection of official documents, territorial forms, tax records, and correspondence between various marshals that revealed the scope of the corruption Mitchell had been fighting. Among the papers was Marshal Bradford's real identification, documents proving that William Henderson had indeed been a territorial marshal with a history of violence and illegal seizure of private property. Mitchell hadn't been killed by a lawman enforcing territorial justice. He'd been murdered by a criminal who'd used his badge to rob and kill innocent people. The truth had been hidden for more than a century, but now Calla had the power to expose it. The question was whether she had the courage to take on a family that had spent generations covering up their ancestors' crimes and had demonstrated they were willing to use both legal and illegal means to protect their secrets. But as she sat in the boat's cabin, surrounded by the evidence of Jonas Mitchell's integrity and the documentation of William Henderson's corruption, Calla realized she didn't have a choice. Mitchell had died protecting the wealth of honest miners from a corrupt marshal. She couldn't dishonor his sacrifice by allowing that marshal's descendants to profit from his crimes. Tomorrow she would begin the process of exposing the truth, and she would face whatever consequences came from challenging people who'd already proven they were willing to lie, steal, and possibly kill to protect their family's dark legacy. The sheriff's badge was tarnished almost black, but the six-pointed star was still clearly visible beneath the corrosion. Calla found it wrapped in oiled leather at the bottom of Mitchell's personal effects, along with official papers that made her breath catch in her throat. Jonas Mitchell hadn't just been a freight coordinator or even a particularly clever smuggler. He'd been a federal marshal working undercover to investigate corruption among territorial officials. The badge bore the seal of the United States Marshal Service, and the accompanying commission papers, signed by the Attorney General himself, authorized Marshal Mitchell to investigate allegations of systematic corruption and criminal activity among territorial law enforcement personnel. The federal government had known about the corruption. Mitchell hadn't been operating outside the law. He'd been operating under direct federal authority to gather evidence against corrupt territorial officials like William Henderson. Calla spread Mitchell's complete documentation across the galley table, finally understanding the full scope of what he'd been trying to accomplish. The smuggling operation had been an undercover investigation designed to document how territorial marshals were robbing miners and settlers under color of law. The careful records of bribes, illegal seizures, and systematic theft weren't evidence of criminal activity. They were of federal marshals' case files, documenting crimes he'd been authorized to investigate. The wealth hidden aboard the boat wasn't just the earnings of honest miners. It was evidence in a federal investigation that had been cut short when Mitchell was murdered by the very official he'd been investigating. But Mitchell's federal commission papers contained one more crucial piece of information. The investigation hadn't died with him. Federal authorities had expected regular reports from Marshal Mitchell, and when those reports stopped coming, they'd initiated procedures to determine what had happened to their undercover operative. According to a document dated December 1898, federal marshals had arrived at Copper Lake to investigate Mitchell's disappearance, but they'd found no trace of him or evidence of what had happened. The local territorial marshal, William Henderson, had reported that Mitchell had never arrived in the area, and that there were no records of his presence at the lake. Henderson had successfully covered up Mitchell's murder and convinced federal investigators that their undercover Marshall had disappeared somewhere else entirely. The cover-up had worked for more than a century, but now Calla had the evidence to expose it. Mitchell's federal commission proved that he'd been operating under legitimate authority. His blood-stained confession identified his murderer, and his carefully documented case files provided evidence of systematic corruption that federal authorities had never been able to prosecute because their investigator had been killed before completing his mission. She spent the afternoon photographing every document, creating digital copies that she stored on a secure device Pete couldn't access even if he searched the boat again. But photographs wouldn't be enough to protect her if the Henderson family decided she posed too great a threat to their secrets. She needed allies, people with authority who could ensure the truth came out, even if something happened to her. The county sheriff's office was located 30 miles from Copper Lake, far enough from local politics to offer some independence from the influences that controlled town government. Sheriff Margaret Dawson had a reputation for competence and integrity that extended well beyond her jurisdiction, and more importantly, she had the authority to investigate crimes that crossed municipal boundaries. Calla's phone call that evening was brief but specific. "I need to report a murder that occurred in 1898, she told Sheriff Dawson. "I have physical evidence, including the victim's dying confession and federal law enforcement credentials that prove the victim was a U.S. Marshal killed while conducting an undercover investigation." The silence that followed suggested Sheriff Dawson was trying to process the implications of what she'd just heard. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to repeat that." Calla explained the situation carefully, describing Mitchell's federal commission, his undercover investigation, and the evidence that proved he'd been murdered by a corrupt territorial marshal. She also described the recent pressure from Copper Lake officials who appeared to be trying to claim Mitchell's evidence for themselves. "Can you bring this evidence to my office?" Sheriff Dawson asked. "I don't think that would be safe," Calla replied. "Local officials are already taking steps to assert control over my property. If I leave the area, they might seize everything while I'm gone." They arranged for Sheriff Dawson to come to Copper Lake the following morning, accompanied by a deputy and a representative from the federal marshal's office who could verify Mitchell's credentials and take custody of his evidence. But Calla's phone call had consequences she hadn't anticipated. Within 2 hours of ending her conversation with Sheriff Dawson, Mayor Henderson arrived at the marina with 3 other men she didn't recognize. Their manner was considerably more aggressive than anything she'd experienced during previous encounters. "We need to talk," Henderson announced, stepping aboard the boat without invitation. "There seem to be some serious misunderstandings about the nature of your restoration project here." The other men followed him aboard, positioning themselves in ways that blocked Calla's access to the boat's exits. She recognized the tactic. They wanted to ensure she couldn't leave while they conducted whatever business they'd come to conduct. "I understand you've been making phone calls to law enforcement agencies outside our jurisdiction," Henderson continued, "spreading stories about historical events that you don't fully understand." "I understand them well enough," Calla replied, keeping her voice steady despite the fear that was building in her chest. "Do you? Because the story you're telling could cause considerable harm to innocent people, based on documents that might not be as authentic as you believe." One of the other men stepped forward, a younger version of Henderson who shared enough facial features to be his son or nephew. Sometimes people get so excited about finding old papers that they don't stop to consider whether those papers might have been planted by someone with ulterior motives. The threat was implicit but clear. They were prepared to claim that Mitchell's evidence had been forged, that Calla had fabricated the documentation, to support false accusations against a respected local family. Federal authorities will be able to verify the authenticity of the documents, she said. Will they? Henderson asked. Because federal authorities are going to find that the boat you've been living on was illegally transferred to you by a town council that didn't have proper authority to make such a transfer. They're going to discover that you've been conducting unauthorized archaeological work on a historically significant site. And they're going to learn that you've been making false accusations against a family that has served this community with distinction for 4 generations. The scenario was carefully constructed to destroy both her credibility and her legal position. Even if Mitchell's documents were eventually verified as authentic, the process would take months, during which she would be facing criminal charges for illegal excavation of historical sites and making false reports to law enforcement. The smart thing, Henderson continued, would be to recognize that you've gotten in over your head with matters that are beyond your understanding. Pack up your belongings, accept reasonable compensation for any inconvenience you've experienced, and find somewhere else to live. And if I don't, then you'll discover that life can become very difficult for people who make enemies in small towns, the younger Henderson said. Especially people who don't have family or connections to protect them when things get complicated. After the men left, Calla sat in her cabin trying to decide what to do next. She could accept their offer and disappear, leaving Mitchell's truth buried for another century. Or she could stay and fight, knowing that she was facing opponents who had both resources and political connections that extended far beyond Copper Lake. But as she held Mitchell's blood-stained confession in her hands, reading once again his account of dying for the principle that honest people deserved protection from corrupt officials, she realized she'd already made her decision. Mitchell had died rather than betray the miners who'd trusted him with their wealth. She couldn't betray his memory by abandoning the fight he'd started. Tomorrow morning, Sheriff Dawson would arrive with federal marshals who could verify Mitchell's credentials and take custody of his evidence. All Calla had to do was survive the night and ensure that the evidence remained intact until proper. Authorities could secure it, but as darkness fell over Copper Lake and she listened to the sounds of boats moving on the water outside her cabin, she understood that the Henderson family had no intention of allowing federal authorities to examine Mitchell's documentation. They'd waited more than a century to claim his treasure, and they weren't going to let one stubborn woman destroy their family's legacy. The real fight was about to begin. The town charter hung in a frame behind Mayor Henderson's desk, but Calla hadn't expected to need it as evidence when Sheriff Dawson arrived with federal marshals at 9 o'clock that morning. The charter dated to 1902, and its language had been carefully crafted to protect individual property rights against municipal overreach. Ironic, given how Henderson was now trying to use municipal authority to seize property that didn't belong to the town. The meeting took place in Martha's restaurant, which had been closed to regular customers for the occasion. Sheriff Dawson had brought Deputy Collins and Federal Marshal Sarah Chen, whose credentials and authority superseded anything the local officials could claim. But Henderson had brought his own reinforcements, a lawyer from the county seat and 2 men he'd introduced only as family representatives. "Let's start with the basics," Marshal Chen said, spreading Mitchell's documents across a table that had been cleared for the purpose. These appear to be genuine federal law enforcement credentials from 1897, along with what looks like an official commission from the U.S. Attorney General's office. She examined the papers with practiced efficiency, comparing details against reference materials she'd brought with her. The Federal Marshal Service maintained extensive historical records. and Chen was able to verify that Jonas Mitchell had indeed been a commissioned federal marshal assigned to investigate territorial corruption. "The commission is authentic," Chen announced. "Marshal Mitchell was operating under direct federal authority when he came to this area." Mayor Henderson leaned forward in his chair, his lawyer whispering something in his ear before he spoke. "That may be true, but it doesn't change the fact that the boat in question was illegally transferred to Ms. Bryer without proper historical review." "Actually, it does," Sheriff Dawson replied, consulting the copy of the town charter she'd requested that morning. "According to your own municipal charter, the town council has full authority to dispose of abandoned property as it sees fit, provided proper notice is given to potential claimants. The boat was abandoned for 20 years. Proper notice was posted, and no claimants came forward. But we've recently discovered that there were potential family claimants who weren't properly notified," Henderson's lawyer interjected. "Who?" Marshal Chen asked. The lawyer hesitated, consulting his notes before responding. "The Henderson family has maintained oral traditions suggesting a family connection to the boat's previous owner." "Oral traditions?" Chen's tone suggested what she thought of such evidence. "Do you have any documentary proof of this family connection?" "Family stories passed down through generations are not legal evidence of ownership," Sheriff Dawson interrupted. "Especially when those stories contradict documented transfers of ownership that were properly executed according to municipal law." Calla watched the exchange with growing confidence. The officials Henderson had expected to intimidate were instead systematically dismantling his attempts to claim legal authority over Mitchell's evidence, but Henderson's family representatives were becoming increasingly agitated as their legal position collapsed. "This is about more than property ownership," the younger Henderson said, his voice tight with anger. "This woman is making serious accusations against respected members of our community based on documents that could easily have been forged. The documents have been verified as authentic," Marshal Chen replied. "Federal law enforcement credentials from this period included specific security features that would be difficult to forge, even with modern technology, but the accusations they contain are allegations made by a federal law enforcement officer who was investigating corruption among territorial officials," Chen continued. "These are serious criminal accusations that fall under federal jurisdiction, regardless of how much time has passed." Henderson stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the restaurant floor. "This is ridiculous. You're talking about events that supposedly happened more than a century ago, based on the word of a man who disappeared without a trace." "He didn't disappear," Calla said quietly. "He was murdered." "And I can prove it." She produced Mitchell's blood-stained confession, which she'd kept separate from the other documents until this moment. The letter's contents silenced the room as Marshal Chen read Mitchell's account of his confrontation with the corrupt territorial marshal. "This is a dying declaration," Chen said, her voice grave. "In legal terms, this is one of the most reliable forms of testimony, because people facing death have no motivation to lie about events." Henderson's face had gone pale as the implications of Mitchell's confession became clear. The letter didn't just accuse his ancestor of corruption, it provided specific details about the murder that could potentially be verified through other historical records. "You're talking about charging people with crimes based on something written by a man who had every reason to lie about what happened to him," Henderson's lawyer said desperately. "Actually, we're talking about reopening a federal investigation that was never properly completed," Marshal Chen corrected. "Marshal Mitchell was killed while conducting authorized federal law enforcement activities. That makes his murder a federal crime with no statute of limitations." The room fell silent as everyone processed the full implications of what they'd just heard. Henderson's family hadn't just been covering up historical embarrassment. They'd been accessories to a federal crime that could still be prosecuted under current law, and Calla realized she was no longer just fighting to keep Mitchell's treasure. She was fighting to ensure that justice was finally served for a federal marshal who'd died protecting honest people from corrupt officials whose descendants were now sitting across the table from her, desperately trying to maintain control over secrets that had finally come to light. The Federal Marshal's Commission lay on the table like an accusation, its official seals and signatures, proof that everything Calla had discovered was not only true, but carried the full weight of federal law enforcement authority. Marshal Chen had spent 20 minutes verifying the document against historical records, and her conclusion was unequivocal. Jonas Mitchell was a commissioned federal marshal operating under direct orders from Washington, Chen announced to the silent room. His investigation into territorial corruption was authorized at the highest levels of the Justice Department, and his murder represents a federal crime that remains prosecutable under current law. Mayor Henderson's face had gone from pale to gray as the implications became clear. His ancestor hadn't just killed a man, he'd assassinated a federal law enforcement officer who was conducting an official investigation. "This commission letter changes everything," Sheriff Dawson added, examining the document that Mitchell had hidden with his other evidence. Marshal Mitchell wasn't just authorized to investigate corruption, he was specifically tasked with documenting criminal activity by territorial officials. For federal prosecution, the commission letter was dated 6 months before Mitchell's final journal entry, and it provided explicit authorization for him to employ whatever means necessary, including assuming false identity and engaging in activities that might appear to violate territorial law, in order to gather evidence of systematic criminal activity among territorial law enforcement personnel. Henderson's lawyer was frantically taking notes, but his expression suggested he understood that his client's position had become legally untenable. "Even if we accept that these documents are authentic," the lawyer said desperately, "you're talking about events that occurred more than a century ago. Surely there's some statute of limitations, not for murder of a federal officer," Marshal Chen interrupted, "and not when there's evidence of an ongoing conspiracy to conceal the crime and profit from its proceeds." That was the crucial point. The Henderson family's recent attempts to claim Mitchell's treasure weren't just greedy opportunism. They were continuation of the original crime, making them accessories to the murder their ancestor had committed. "We haven't tried to claim anything," Henderson protested. "We were simply concerned about proper historical preservation. You fabricated a deed claiming family ownership of property that legally belonged to Ms. Bryer," Sheriff Dawson pointed out. "You pressured her to stop renovation work while you searched her boat without authorization. And you threatened her with criminal charges if she reported what she'd found to federal authorities." Calla watched as Henderson's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. The respectful family man, the concerned mayor, the guardian of community interests. All of it fell away to reveal someone who'd been desperately trying to cover up his family's criminal legacy. "You don't understand," Henderson said, his voice breaking. "My great-grandfather wasn't a murderer. He was trying to protect the community from criminals who were using federal authority to rob honest settlers." "Your great-grandfather was the criminal," Chen replied. "Marshal Mitchell's investigation documented systematic theft, extortion, and violence perpetrated by territorial officials against innocent miners and settlers. Your ancestor killed a federal officer to prevent that evidence from reaching Washington." Henderson's son stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Even if that's true, it has nothing to do with us. We can't be held responsible for something that happened before we were born. You can, when you've spent generations covering it up and trying to profit from it," Sheriff Dawson said. "The fake deed, the pressure campaign, the threats, all of that constitutes ongoing criminal activity related to the original murder." Marshal Chen gathered the documents carefully, preparing to take custody of Mitchell's evidence for federal review. "This investigation will be reopened under current federal jurisdiction," she announced. All evidence will be processed according to modern forensic standards, and charges will be filed against anyone who has participated in concealing the original crime or attempting to profit from its proceeds. The younger Henderson made one last, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. What about the community? Copper Lake has been our family's home for 4 generations. Are you going to destroy an entire town over something that happened in 1898? It was Calla who answered, speaking for the first time since producing Mitchell's confession. Marshal Mitchell died protecting honest miners from corrupt officials, she said quietly. The wealth hidden on that boat belongs to the descendants of the people he was trying to help. Your family has been sitting on stolen money for more than a century. Money that was taken from working people who trusted the law to protect them. She looked directly at Mayor Henderson, seeing in his face the recognition that his family's long deception had finally come to an end. The community will survive the truth, she continued. It might even be stronger for it. But the lies end here, Marshal Chen nodded approvingly. Federal authorities will work with local law enforcement to ensure a thorough investigation. Anyone who cooperated with attempts to conceal evidence or intimidate witnesses will face appropriate charges. As the meeting broke up, Calla realized that she'd accomplished something Jonas Mitchell had died trying to achieve. The truth about territorial corruption was finally coming to light, and the honest miners who'd trusted Mitchell with their wealth would finally receive the justice he'd promised them. The Henderson family's century-long cover-up was over, and the secrets buried beneath Copper Lake were about to see daylight at last. The new deed arrived by federal courier on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after Marshal Chen had reopened the Jonas Mitchell murder investigation. The document was considerably more substantial than the fake papers Pete had delivered, bearing official seals from both the county clerk's office and the federal court that had resolved all challenges to Calla's ownership of the boat and its contents. She signed the papers sitting at the galley table where she'd first read Mitchell's journal, surrounded by the sounds of construction that had been echoing across the lake for weeks. The boat itself had been transformed from a floating derelict into something approaching its original elegance. But the real transformation was happening on the shoreline, where the new Jonas Mitchell Memorial Museum was taking shape. Federal investigators had worked through the winter to verify every aspect of Mitchell's documentation, using modern forensic techniques to confirm the authenticity of his evidence and trace the connections between his territorial-era investigation and the crimes he'd documented. The results had vindicated everything he'd claimed about corruption among territorial officials and provided enough evidence to reopen several cold cases from the 1890s. More importantly, the investigation had identified the legitimate owners of the wealth Mitchell had been protecting. Census records, mining claim documents, and Mitchell's own careful notes had allowed federal authorities to trace the descendants of the 12 miners whose gold and silver had been hidden aboard the boat. Most of those families were still living in the region, their current circumstances often reflecting the economic hardship that had followed when their ancestors' wealth had disappeared. The federal court had ruled that the treasure belonged to those descendants, but it had also recognized Calla's role in discovering and protecting Mitchell's evidence. Her portion of the settlement, 20% of the total value, plus clear title to the boat, had been enough to fund both her comfortable retirement and the museum project that would ensure Mitchell's story was never forgotten again. Mayor Henderson had resigned in disgrace after pleading guilty to charges related to his attempts to conceal evidence and intimidate witnesses. His son faced additional charges for filing false legal documents and making terroristic threats. The Henderson family's century-long Copper Lake politics had ended with federal marshals serving warrants at the same town hall where 4 generations of Hendersons had wielded authority over their neighbors. But the most satisfying resolution had come when Calla met with the descendants of Mitchell's miners to discuss how their recovered inheritance should be distributed. The families had decided unanimously to use part of their recovered wealth to establish a foundation dedicated to fighting corruption in law enforcement, a fitting tribute to the federal marshal who died protecting their ancestors. From exactly such corruption, the museum occupied the boat's original structure, with exhibits that told the story of territorial-era corruption and the federal investigation that had finally brought justice more than a century later. Mitchell's personal effects, his commission papers, and his carefully documented evidence were displayed in climate-controlled cases that allowed visitors to see the physical proof of his courage and integrity, but it was Mitchell's blood-stained confession that drew the most attention from visitors. Displayed behind bulletproof glass with lighting that made the dark stains visible without damaging the fragile paper. A placard beside the display quoted Mitchell's final words. "The gold and silver hidden aboard this boat represents the life savings of working men who trusted me to protect their earnings from corrupt officials. It is not stolen treasure, but stolen justice." Calla had become the museum's director, a role that allowed her to share Mitchell's story with the thousands of visitors who came to Copper Lake each year to learn about one man's fight against government corruption. School groups were especially interested in the story, perhaps because it demonstrated how individual courage could ultimately triumph over institutional power. The boat itself had been restored to period authenticity, with the hidden compartments preserved as part of the exhibit. Visitors could see exactly how Mitchell had concealed the evidence that would eventually expose his murderer. And they could walk through the same spaces where he'd spent his final weeks documenting the crimes he'd witnessed. Pete Kowalski had sold the marina and left Copper Lake shortly after the federal investigation began. His cooperation with the Henderson family's attempts to claim Mitchell's treasure had earned him probation and community service. But the shame of being exposed as part of the cover-up had driven him away from the community he'd served for decades. Martha's restaurant had become the unofficial headquarters for tourists visiting the museum, and Martha had expanded her menu to include items she claimed were based on recipes from Mitchell's era. Whether historically accurate or not, the food was excellent, and the restaurant's walls were covered with photographs and documents from the territorial period that helped visitors understand the context of Mitchell's investigation. As Calla walked through the museum that evening, checking exhibits and preparing to close for the day, she reflected on how much her life had changed since she'd first claimed an abandoned boat as shelter. She'd found not just a home, but a purpose. Not just treasure, but justice for people who'd been dead for more than a century. The lake outside her windows was peaceful in the evening light, its surface reflecting the mountains that surrounded the valley like protective walls. But she knew now that the peace was built on truth rather than silence, on justice rather than secrets buried in the darkness. Jonas Mitchell's story had finally been told. His evidence had finally been heard, and his murderer's crime had finally been exposed. The wealth he'd died protecting had been returned to its rightful owners, and his memory had been honored with a monument that would ensure future generations understood the price of integrity. Sometimes the things everyone else throws away do hold the greatest treasures. But the real treasure isn't always gold and silver. Sometimes it's truth, preserved by someone brave enough to protect it until the world is ready to hear it. And sometimes, when you're patient enough to wait and